If we were to draw back for a moment and look at this from a kind of global perspective, I think it's fascinating to look at how the animal agriculture industry impacts what we can do about global hunger.
Yes, yes, and that's another next level of creating more racially and socially equitable societies. I actually born and raised in India, and I was raised in a very low income family, and I have seen the way hunger actually looks like in the developing countries like India. And what's amazing is that many people in developed countries make an argument that we need to have actually, animals on the ground, because look, how many underdeveloped and developing countries are actually depend on the meat and dairy. But the reality is that globally, we are actually using 77% of our farmland to produce only 18% of calories. And when we look at per capita meat consumption, it's much higher in developed countries like United States. So developed countries don't get a chance to actually give an excuse to continue the consumption of meat and dairy at higher rates by pointing finger at the developing countries. Because developing countries like India, we actually depend highly on a plant-based food system. And when we talk about meat, it's a side dish. It's not the main course, which is the case in most of the developed countries.
I'm not sure that most people realize that on average it takes about 100 grams of plant-based food to create 5 grams of meat protein, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of comparisons out there that actually talks about how much of the plant-based calories and plant-based protein has to actually flush into the animal agriculture to produce the animal-derived products, right? And what goes in and what comes out, there's a gap between it, right? If we talk about beef, for an example, there's a 94% of the protein that's actually lost in between, and that is a right? We always talk about a conventional food waste at the retailer end, at the consumer end, but the major food waste that we need to focus on if we want to actually close the gap of food insecurity and fight the world hunger is the gap that's being created by actually focusing more on the animal-derived food system.
Now, looking towards a brighter future, what do you believe can be done to correct all of these mistakes we're making?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because once we understand the problem, we need to actually also talk about the solution as well. And the solution for me is not that tomorrow the world needs to go vegan, right? The solution is that we need to start shifting our food system towards plant-based food. So plant-forward food system is something that what I actually envision as a sustainable world. And often I'm actually always asked, how much shift do I need to actually make, right, in order to be sustainable? And for that, what I often look at, for an example, in United States, the University of Michigan actually published a study saying if we replace 50% of animal-derived product with plant-based food, then we can reduce 51% of United States greenhouse gas emissions. That to me can also take off the burden of slaughtering animal at a higher rate, right? Lower down the injuries that we are actually talking about. When we talk about the CAFOs, it would not actually require to produce millions of animals and reduce the impact of environment in surrounding communities. So I would say that incorporating 50% shift is a really good place to actually start.
So you have said that the biggest challenge that humankind faces right now isn't climate change, isn't poverty, it isn't wars or inequality, but it is the origin, and the origin singular, of these that poses the largest threat to our future.
Yeah, and That's a really good question. And as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in a low-income family, so always my heart was addressing the homelessness and helping out the unhoused community. And and then I actually was encountered with the domestic violence. Then I was encountered with the animal cruelty. Then I learned about the environmental degradation. And I started focusing on if there is an origin of all these social and environmental issues, and if there is one, can we address that? And so in my reading research, I actually found out that we're living in a highly interconnected world where our well-being is dependent on a fellow human beings, animals, environment, and vegetation. But often we actually forget this interconnected nature of our world, even when the globalization is taking place, is exponentially growing, and we are coming close every day. But but the way we actually live our life completely ignores this interconnected nature. And that's why we fail to empathize with our fellow human beings, with animals, and with environment.
Would you say at all that was perhaps capitalism giving people a false sense of individualism and not allowing them to realize the kind of interconnectivity of the entire world? I'm not just talking about the globalization, the human connections, but also our connections with the animal kingdom, with the planet itself.
Yeah, and what you're saying, I totally understand, and I agree with that as well. That capitalism gives us this sense that we are individual, and what we need to do is just to protect our own self and individuality, as well as the people who surround us, relatives, families. And how we do that is just by making money, right? And not considering everyone else. So yes, that definitely the capitalism creates the sense of individuality that allows us to ignore the interconnected nature of our world. But I also see that there are several people out there living in the same capitalistic society with this interconnected perspective, and they are living a sustainable lifestyle. So I definitely don't blame capitalism, even though I see that how it creates the sense of individuality.
In your world, is there such a thing as the ethical consumption of animal products?
So where I actually like where my heart is rooted is also I talked about the environment. I talked about the systemic racism. Now, if I talk about the animal welfare, I feel that the understanding that we are interconnected and empathizing with each one of us allows us to treat the animals in the same way we actually treat the human beings. And if we disregard that, that's a speciesism. All the social and environmental degradation that we are actually facing right now is also associated with that speciesism. So in order to give animals the right that we actually dedicate to human society, I do think that a final vision that I have is not to actually abuse animals, not only for food, but also for laboratory testing, also for their fur, also for any fashion, any form of cosmetic testing. So yes, I do envision the world where speciesism does not exist anymore.
And so that would mean nurturing and educating people about an interspecies empathy, right?
Yes, and that's very true. And so that's definitely the final goal. And I would love to actually get into that if anyone's interested. But what happens is when we always talk about the final goal, it scares people off, right? And they feel next day they have to actually go vegan, and they just want to leave the whole conversation, right? Because changing human behavior is so hard. I did not actually go vegan next day. It took me a time, right? So for everyone else, it's the same process. And so when I actually just finally talk about going vegan, people do actually get scared. And so that's why I talk about shifting our food system and moving towards the plant-based food system.
I found your background rather interesting. So you grew up in India, and you had a plant-based diet there, but there was a lot of dairy involved, of course. And then when you went to university, there was this belief that if one was eating meat, it made one stronger, more muscular. And you kind of bought into that, which I thought was quite amusing. And then you moved to the States and you started doing your master's there. And that was when you started learning a little bit more about the animal agriculture system. What was your road to Damascus moment? What was that thing? Where did you have that epiphany that made you change your feelings and turned you to where you are today?
Yeah, no, that's really a good question. And that's how, majority of the society works, the toxic masculinity works, which is
right.
Another really interesting facet.
I can talk to you about this for some time, but yes.
No. So when I was in university, I definitely thought that being strong, consuming meat was good. When I moved to the university in the United States, at that time, I had a fellow student who was actually vegan, and she started explaining me how even the dairy is associated with so much of cruelty, and that actually got me into reading more, researching more, and slowly shifting my food system, my diet towards plant-based food. And it took me after that probably 5 or 6 years to actually completely go vegan. So that was the time when I started shifting my own diet.
Interesting. So let's talk a little bit about your nonprofit, Cultivate Empathy For All. Now, you are focusing solely upon empowering city residents to advocate for plant-based policies. Explain a little bit more about that, because I like this idea of advocating for cities divesting themselves from this factory farming that we've been speaking of.
The reason why we are actually targeting cities is because most cities actually don't really recognize the environmental impact of the food system, right? Because the food, as we mentioned earlier, is being produced outside their city limits. And when we talk about greenhouse gas emission inventory for cities, they only look at the goods and services produced within the city limits.
Yes. Yeah.
So meaning in the United States, across all cities and towns, the food emissions are going unaddressed. And so that's why that's a huge gap that we need to talk to our local lawmakers. And so that's why we actually empower and mobilize the city residents to educate their city councils on this particular gap. And then once they understand that this is the gap that's created, definitely they won't have the expertise to create the policies. So we draft them. And then we actually propose them, we work with them, and then we get it actually passed.
Now, what kind of buy-in have you had from your hometown of Berkeley there?
Yeah, so with the Berkeley, it was the same thing that we only focused on the production-based inventory, not looking at the food system. So it took me, several activists have actually worked on the food system, educating city council. And just this year, we hit the milestone when city of Berkeley actually adopted Vision 2025, which actually asked this city to replace 50% of that animal-derived food procurement with plant-based food. Right. And this procurement is mainly in city-governed facilities like senior centers and etc.
Well, that's fantastic. And you are planning to spread this out across the country, right?
Yes, that's correct. That's actually the vision that I have. And it's definitely not that just Vision 2025. I think that there are several other good programs like Green Monday, and there are other initiatives that cities can actually take in order to start shifting towards the plant-based food system.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today at Good Food Revolution. I could talk to you about so many facets of this all day, but I know that you're a very busy man. please join us again at some point in the future, and we can discuss how the progress of your project is moving on. And have a wonderful day over there in California. We really appreciate your insights.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jimmy. I really appreciate the time talking with you.
Bye for now.
Yeah.